This is U.S. History Regents Review for Unit 1. This is our final part of Unit 1. We are finally finishing. This is a big unit. We've been talking about the government, how it's set up by the Constitution, how it functions, and we're going to just wrap up some of the important themes that we see in the Constitution and how our government works. So one of these last important principles is flexibility. The Constitution is considered to be a living document. It's alive. It can change with the times. And how it does this, one of the most important ways is through the elastic clause. This is a clause in the Constitution under the section of the legislative branch, Article 1, and it gives Congress the power to create any laws that are necessary and proper to the functioning of government. Anything necessary and proper. This is vague on purpose. It gives Congress a lot of flexibility, again, in the way that it creates laws. So one of the first things, for example, this elastic clause does is it allows the federal government to create a national bank. Alexander Hamilton will use that elastic clause to create a bank. We use the elastic clause to create the Air Force. There are many things that we see the government is allowed to do because of the elastic clause, the powers of Congress. And this goes along with a term called implied powers. It's implied, meaning it's not explicitly stated, but it's implied that the government has the power to do a lot of things that aren't necessarily written there. And sometimes this depends on whether or not someone has a loose versus a strict interpretation of the Constitution, meaning do they look for exactly what it says and only do the exact things that you find there? That's a strict interpretation. Or are you kind of more loose with your interpretation, meaning that you understand that there are powers that are implied, that you can go a little bit beyond just what is stated right there in the Constitution. So that also can give flexibility. There's an amending process. We can change the Constitution. These are called amendments when we add on to the Constitution and change it. The first big change are those first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, which they do almost immediately. They amend the Constitution right after passing it initially and getting it ratified by the states. There's another principle called the Unwritten Constitution. What? It's unwritten. Again, things that are not written in the Constitution, but they are important practices for how we actually run government. So the most significant examples of this are political parties. Nowhere in the Constitution does it mention political parties, and yet our government would not run without it. Political parties are responsible for narrowing down and selecting candidates for voters to choose from. The cabinet is not written in the Constitution, but George Washington creates this. We have special interest groups that represent these special interests, things that people want in government. For example, the NRA, the National Rifle Association, is a major interest group that tries to pass laws to keep gun ownership easy to obtain. And special interest groups do a practice called lobbying. That comes from the word lobby. Like literally, people from special interest groups will go wait in the lobbies of congressmen to try to get them to approve laws that they like. And then there are congressional committees to process through all laws that are proposed, to organize them, to set up what order that the Congress might discuss them on the floor and vote for them. All these things are really important for the logistics of running government, but they are not in the Constitution. Again, that's why it's called the Unwritten Constitution. And finally, we come back to judicial review, because the Supreme Court can reinterpret the Constitution. This gives some flexibility. The most significant example of this is the court case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. This is right after Reconstruction, the Civil War. Slavery is ended just a couple decades before this. Plessy versus Ferguson states that there can be separate but equal facilities, meaning schools can be separate. Blacks and whites can be separate. Bathrooms, drinking fountains, all those Jim Crow laws, the Supreme Court says, hey, those are totally fine, totally constitutional. Feel free to separate blacks and whites as long as what they get is equal. But as people quickly figured out, separate is not inherently equal. So the Supreme Court reinterprets that court case in Brown versus Board of Education. Almost 60 years later, 1954, this is the start of the civil rights movement. They say, no, separate is not equal, and schools must be integrated. So this is a critical example of the flexibility of the federal government. The Supreme Court can change its mind on certain things. Our very last principle for the Constitution we will discuss for Unit 1 is this idea of limited government, citizenship, and rights. We're going to combine all these. The Constitution created a republic, which means it's a representative democracy. We vote for representatives to make decisions on our behalf. This is not a pure democracy. We don't vote directly on laws, generally speaking. The founding fathers actually feared the rule of the people. The people are uneducated. They're not virtuous. They're not going to make good decisions. So they should get representatives who are going to make those wise decisions for them. So that's why this is a republic, not a direct democracy. However, we do call our country a democracy because the people have a very important role in it and have important rights. Our government is limited. It has limited powers. It does not have absolute power. Being someone who is born in this country, you are granted the rights of citizens, rights that are protected by the Constitution. However, one of the huge themes of this course is that most of our country's history has been a debate over who actually gets to enjoy these rights. In particular, it has not always included the poor, minorities, immigrants, or women. This is a debate that continues today. Who gets to access those rights? And how do we actually guarantee that these groups get equal rights as every other citizen? Thank you for watching. Feel free to review any of these videos, and I recommend taking some practice quizzes with Unit 1 questions after watching these to see if you understood the content and if you need to go over anything. Thanks.